Before the 1400s, on both sides of the boundary between Christian Europe and the Muslim world, you had small fragmented states. So on neither side do you have one political authority that governs everything. For that reason, for instance, if European traders from Venice or Genoa come to the Levant, and if the rulers of Alexandria don't allow them in or ask them too much money to conduct business, they can go someplace else. They can go to Aleppo or Haifa or whatever other port there is, because chances are they're all governed by different rulers. And the same is true for the Muslims. If they don't want to deal with the merchants from Genoa, they can deal with those from Venice and so forth. In fact, Islam, unlike Christianity, has two provisions that are beneficial to European traders. First, there's a general sense, and this goes back straight to Muhammad, that you have to protect and respect merchants that are coming through your lands and strangers at any rate. And secondly, Judaism is recognized in Islam as a legitimate religion of people who believe in the book or in a book. It's a book-based religion. The assumption in Islam is that Judaism and Christianity are in their own incomplete and distorted ways, but nonetheless worshiping Allah, the one true God, while Islam has it right because they recognize Muhammad as an additional final prophet. Nevertheless, those two religions based on the prophets Abraham, that is Judaism, and Jesus, Christianity, have a partial truth, but they're not heathen, they're not alien. So they're allowed into the Muslim lands. For instance, the city of Jerusalem, which has been under Muslim control for a long, long time, sees pilgrims from the West. And yes, of course, this is, if you will, income from tourism. So it's also about making money, same as with the trade. But the realization, as often the case, is that warfare is in fact costly, and that if you have friendly relations with your neighbors, this is beneficial. What changes, however, is that starting in the 1200s, but really slowly building up to this moment, another group of Central Asian horsemen warriors, who at the time when they arrived in the Middle East from the north, out of Turkmenistan, were heathens, wanted to conquer Baghdad and sort of succeeded. However, they went native, and the Muslim rulers of Baghdad said, well, welcome to Iraq, have some gold, have some land, and let us tell you about Allah and the Quran. And so the Turks adopted Islam and settled in eastern Anatolia, which had been ruled by the Christian Byzantine Empire before, but that had been conquered in the High Middle Ages. However, due to warfare, this region was now very thinly settled, and it was a disputed borderland. So the rulers in Baghdad figured, if you have this tribe of warriors settling here, they will make for a good border police. They will defend the boundary, and they will also make good use of the land when they go and settle down here as farmers. And so they did. However, the dynasty founded by a man named Osman, and based on that, called the Ottomans, that governed the Turks, never quite abandoned their ambitions that they had coming out of Central Asia for world power, as it were. So they used their new home in eastern Anatolia as a power base to build up strength to pursue their goals. And since they were now Muslims, their main goal became to unify under their rule the Muslim world. What better way is there to do that than to first build a reputation by conquering parts of enemy land, namely of Christian Europe? And the biggest prize, the most valuable chunk of Christian Europe, where you still had vestiges of civilization, was of course the Byzantine Empire, and especially the strategically important and ancient city of Constantinople. Over many wars, eventually by 1453, the Ottomans succeeded in capturing Constantinople, thus ending the Byzantine Empire. This, in a related story, set off a flight of scholars, theologians, scientists, and so forth from Byzantium, from Constantinople, who went to the next best place in the West that they were aware of, Italy, home formerly of the West Roman Empire, and of course Byzantium was the East Roman Empire. So now you have all these highly educated people with access to texts that had long been forgotten in the West, who take up residence in Rome, in Florence, and so forth, and before you know it, you get the Renaissance as a result. But to continue with our story, the Ottomans capture not just the Byzantine Empire, but the weak border states on the Balkans, and they advance almost as far as Vienna, which is the capital city of Austria, but also the seat of the Emperor of Germany. In part, as a response to this advance of the Ottomans, the unifying Kingdom of Spain, patched together through marriage from the previous kingdoms of Aragon, modern-day Catalonia, and Castile, to cement this union between these two kingdoms and their merger into the Kingdom of Spain. The king and queen, Ferdinand and Isabella, decided to conquer what was left of Muslim rule in southern Spain, the Kingdom of Granada. So by 1492, they took that, and that concluded a good 700 years of reconquest, where at one point, all of Spain, all of the Iberian Peninsula had been governed by Muslims, and slowly, over many centuries, Christian kingdoms out of the Pyrenees, these mountains here between France and Spain, had taken back 1 foot at a time this land, until eventually by 1492 they were done. An offshoot of this is that the warrior caste, the Knights of Spain, that had been fighting somebody all their lives, some religious other, some non-Europeans, for as long as there were still Muslims in Spain, now had nothing to do, and to them, the conquest of the New World became a new outlet for their warlike tendencies. So if you think of the conquistadors, like Pizarro or Cortes, who went and took down the Inca and Aztec empires respectively, that is their background, that is their cultural background and their professional background. They're in the business of fighting harshly, ruthlessly against non-Christians, non-European. But the combination of these two moves really established two things. First, now you have at least one strong state on the Christian side, the Spanish. And it so happens that the Spanish king is actually the same guy as the Austrian emperor. So as Emperor of Germany, the King of Spain, who follows when Ferdinand dies, that's the same person. So you now have one large state entity that governs this part and that part of Europe, facing another large state entity on the Muslim side, the Ottomans, who by the mid-1500s actually managed to conquer all of the coastline of the Mediterranean from other Muslim states and to make themselves the rulers of almost all of Islam, of the Ummah, of Muslim believers, which had been their goal. So now they can call themselves caliphs as well as sultans, secular and religious rulers of the Muslim civilization. And what they do with that position of power is they now impose a unified trade policy. They now enforce tariffs, fees for European traders across all the ports of the Mediterranean. No longer, therefore, is it possible for the merchants of Venice and Genoa to play different Muslim authorities against each other. They now have to pay up if they want any access at all to India and to world trade. This wouldn't be prohibitive. They could still do trade, but they'd rather not be paying. So they are not happy about this. To add insult to injury from the point of view of these Christian merchants, the only people still allowed under the previous lighter fees and tariffs into the Muslim world are the Jews of Europe. This is in part the Ottoman Empire playing politics, because Jews were mistreated in Spain under the Reconquest of Granada. After the Reconquest was done, the Spanish Inquisition goes to town, finding, converting, or killing Jews that were living in Spain. And many of these Jews found a new home offered to them by the Ottomans in the city of Constantinople, where many nice apartments were now available because Byzantines, Christians, had left for Italy previously. And in part to emphasize this status of the Ottomans, of the Muslim world, as friends and protectors of Judaism, to give Jewish European merchants, who, by the way, outside of Spain in the 1400s were now also increasingly faced with discrimination, murder, pogroms, and so forth. So the Ottomans played politics by saying, we have your back. You're still welcome in our lands, and you get full rights as citizens. You get your own religious courts, your own authorities, and so forth. But this is the background against which the Europeans start thinking about other ways of getting to these places that they want to trade with, India and China. What had been a relatively open boundary now becomes a barrier against access to that trade. Now, the Portuguese, using capital made available from Genoa and Venice, succeed as early as 1481 in finding a way to the southern end of Africa, just kind of feeling their way around the coast of Africa and eventually getting to the southern tip. At that point, however, they kind of hit a wall, or rather the ocean, the conditions at the very southern tip of Africa are harsh. You have constant wind and currents going in a westward direction. So you really can get around there with the technology at the time. And even today, it's a formidable undertaking to cross that, that cape. What results from the attempt of the Portuguese to go down the coast of Africa, however, is an improved knowledge of conditions in the Atlantic. Previously, the Atlantic had been this unknown ocean. Nobody went out there, not much further than to just follow the coastlines here. Barely even across the mouth of the Bay of Biscay here. So now the Portuguese were actually systematically exploring conditions on the Atlantic Ocean. And what they found, and what you can see on this map here, is the currents and the winds that predominate year-round in these different parts of that ocean. So in blue, you have the wind direction. As you see here, the Earth's atmosphere is kind of divided into bands and cells when it comes to the climate and the winds. So the winds tend to blow in these directions in these particular regions. And then in black, you have the currents, the ocean currents. Ideally, to get places fast, you want to sail with the wind and with the current. If you have only the wind or the current on your side, you're still good. But the worst is if you have to sail against the wind and against the current. That'll really slow you down. And if you can avoid it, you will. So if you look at this map and you think, how are you going to get from here to there? And how are you going to get back from Lisbon to the coast of Benguela just before you get to South Africa? Getting south is not that hard because you go with the winds and currents at the coast of West Africa. And down here, if you sail really close to the coast, you see that here the currents and the wind don't go all the way to the coast. So you get relatively mild waters where there isn't a lot of motion if you stick close to the coast. Then going back home at first, you can sail with the wind and with the current. You can't go back up here because on the coast of West Africa, the current and the wind both come straight up to the coast. So this isn't going to work. You can, however, use the current here, the South Canary current. You can sail at an angle to the wind until you reach the Sargasso Sea, where there is not much of a current, this North Atlantic gyre, but where you do have wind that will take you across. And eventually you'll hit the Gulf Stream on the north end of the North Atlantic gyre, and that'll take you back to Lisbon. So the fastest way from here, from the south back north, is to take a big swing out west through the center of the Atlantic, and that'll eventually get you back home. So Columbus knows this, and he assumes, as he lays out his plans to the King of Spain, that he might be able to catch that current across the ocean all the way to Japan, shown here on the map as Cipango. So Columbus thought that he could just catch the wind and the current that takes the sailors, the European sailors, let's see, south into the Atlantic. He could use that momentum here to take him over to Japan across this ocean. So here you see this line I had previously shown, where Europe is now no longer able to trade quite as freely with the rest of the world. But if you can get to India and to China, Cathay here, and to Japan this way, then you're good. By the way, the reason that Columbus knew about the conditions in the Atlantic, which of course the navigational knowledge that the Portuguese gained, you'd think they would want to keep for themselves. But the people who are doing all that exploration, especially the people who do the navigation, that is to say, finding your way around an ocean, are all Italians. They're sailors from Genoa and from Venice who are essentially out of work because they have no more sailing in the Mediterranean to do. And with the backing of merchant capital that is also sitting idle with no ventures to fund, likewise out of Genoa and Venice, these Italians are now offering their services and making proposals to the kings of England, France, Spain, and Portugal to say, let's go find another way around the world to tap back into these world trading networks. So if you thought of Christopher Columbus as a Spaniard, that is actually wrong. He was born in Genoa in Italy under the name of Cristoforo Colombo. And for other and before he signed on with the Spanish, he had tried to get the French, the Portuguese, and the English to finance his scheme. And if you've heard about the famed English explorer Henry Cabot, who ended up discovering Newfoundland in what is today Canada, Henry Cabot was born under the name of Enrico Cabuto, likewise in Genoa in Italy. So all these people here who are Spanish and Portuguese explorers are for the most part either themselves Italian or they have navigators, helmsmen, etc., who are Italian. But like I said, Columbus's project for sailing around the world to India, which of course the Portuguese were trying to go around this way, around the Cape of Good Hope. The reason people didn't believe he was going to succeed is because, unlike Columbus, they were aware that the stretch from Europe to Asia was far longer than what this map, which is the map that Columbus used, assumed. If you look at this map and you compare it with that circular map that I showed you, what you basically have is that the left half of the circle here is taken and the map is cut down the middle, and then the right half here is just put on the other side. And in between, you have these two stretches of sea that are just kind of randomly assumed that's about how far it's going to be. Well, it isn't. And people whose business it was to know these things were aware that the Earth is 40,000 kilometers in circumference. And since they also knew how far it is from here to there and from there to here, that is to say how far it was around the known world, they knew it was much, much further across, except Columbus didn't acknowledge that. So his plan was based on poor science, poor scientific knowledge, or the lack of acknowledging what was known. People who cautioned the kings of Europe against funding his scheme were saying they'll starve, they'll die, they will run out of fresh water and out of food long before they get anywhere near land. To make that point, look at here a map of the real world versus Columbus's map. On this end here, top right, the blue outlines taken from Columbus's map show Africa and Europe, and that is our anchor point. This is where Europe is really located. Now, on the west end, in blue, this is where Columbus assumed he would find Japan. In red, you have the actual outlines of America. So, as you know, this is where we are in California. Japan is quite a ways over this way. If it hadn't been for the accidental continent in the middle, around the time that Columbus and his little fleet got to Hispaniola, where they first made landfall, they were starting to run out of food and water. So they were about maybe a quarter of the way to Japan. The critics, therefore, were right. They would have run out of food and water and died miserably in the middle of the ocean if they hadn't had such dumb luck. So while Columbus's attempt to find a way to India, although of course he died still claiming he had found a way to India, which is why Native Americans were long called Indians, which is very confusing, as well as disrespectful. But the Portuguese had actually succeeded where Columbus failed. After 1481, they worked hard to find a way across that Cape of Good Hope. And just little by little, they made their way up until finally they reached Zanzibar, where they now encountered traders from India and from the Arab world that knew how to get to India. But of course, these traders knew when they met the Portuguese who they were dealing with. They knew that the Europeans now had figured out how to get around Africa, and they were really not in any mood to help them, the competitors, achieve their goal. The Portuguese did what subsequent European colonizers would also do. They played local enemies against each other. So I think it was the traders of Zanzibar and the traders of Dar es Salaam who were competitors, and the Portuguese promised to use their fleet to help one against the other in exchange for knowledge of how to get across the Indian Ocean, in exchange for getting a a pilot, somebody with local knowledge of the waters, and that is eventually how they made it to India. And likewise, setting a pattern here of European interaction with the rest of the world, when they came to a city on the coast of India, rather than say, hello, we would like to set up shop here so that we can trade with you, they said, this is now our city, we will be in charge. And they fought this out and they won. And they occupied the city, and this became the first permanent European outpost in India. This is the beginning of a long history of European aggression in Asia and colonization. By the 1570s, the Portuguese had made their way to Japan, by the way, and they had also established a couple of other trading posts along the way. But even though the Portuguese did quite well, because now they had a monopoly on selling spices, as well as fine cloth from Asia in Europe, and that established a whole lot of wealth in Portugal, the Spanish were the ones who had lucked out. Once the Americas are discovered, conquered, exploited, and developed, they become the engine of world commerce and of the world economy. And the North Atlantic, the waters here, replace the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean and the China Sea as the main highway of world commerce. Even today, if you look at the map of ocean routes, of trade routes across the ocean, the thickest band of vessels traveling between places is still between Europe and America. That, in spite of the fact that so much manufacturing goes on in Asia and products are taken across the Pacific from there to America. In the North Atlantic, nevertheless, that is still the main conduit of world trade. And this map shows what Europeans knew in 1500, like how much of the world they had uncovered. And it's quite a bit. As you can see, they didn't quite know Australia yet. And there was much about the North Pacific that they hadn't found, as well as almost the entire interior of Africa, some of which Europeans don't get to see until the late 1800s. And it isn't the Portuguese, but the Spanish that stand to reap the benefits of this new economy. Now, you may be aware that one of the sources of wealth in Spain was the theft of gold from the Aztecs and the Inca that was shipped along the Spanish Main by annual gold fleets that sailed back to Europe. But this is, in fact, only half the story, or less than that. The main thing that paid the bills for the colonial empire of the Spanish in America was the export of silver to China. And the silver was taken also in an annual fleet to the city of Manila in the Philippines, which was founded for that purpose, and then onward to the Chinese mainland. The reason there was a high demand for silver in China was that the Chinese state issued a central currency, and they had decided to base that on silver. They minted silver coins in opposition to Europe, where it's mostly gold coins. And the Chinese economy was expanding. It was an economic powerhouse at the time, so they needed more and more specie, more and more precious metal to mint more money so that people could conduct business. And the Spanish were ready to supply that. So this, once again, China being a highly developed place, a place of development and economic power that allowed the Spanish to run a successful empire in these Americas. Now, this situation of the Spanish, of wealth and power that came with being in charge of this new world, ironically, as is often the case, created challenges. Many of the problems that the Spanish ran into in the 1500s were the direct result of their success. So in many ways, the success did more damage than good to Spain. But this is something to treat in the next part of this lecture.